Okay, we're going to call the meeting to order, this agenda briefing meeting this morning. I'm going to do a roll call. Mayor Pro Tem, are you here? Here. Mr. Rumbark, you here? Mr. Spears, are you here? Mr. Spears?
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Waddell? Here. Ms. Andrews? Here. Mr. Joyner?
Here.
And the chair is here. We'll begin the meeting. We have consent agenda C1. C2 is a resolution authorizing the city manager to apply for an energy efficiency and conservation block grant from the U.S. Department of Energy. C3 is a resolution authorizing the retirement of Police K-9 Officer Stanley and authorizing transfer of K-9 Officer Stanley to Officer Nathan Salos.
Mr. Mayor.
Yes, sir.
Tomorrow night when this item comes up, if one of the council members would be so kind as to lift it off and let us go ahead and do that, we will have the dog here, but we just didn't want him to have to stay in the room until late in the meeting. So
very good.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. C4 is a resolution authorizing the city manager to purchase 7 police vehicles from Capital Chevrolet Incorporated of Raleigh, North Carolina, in the amount of $377,824 from the Fleet Replacement Fund. C5 is a resolution declaring the list of vehicles and equipment as surplus property to be sold at electronic auction on govdeals.com. C6 is a resolution authorizing the city manager to enter into a contract with Parks Ford HV LLC for the repurchase of 7 Ford Maverick hybrids for $197,875 from the Fleet Replacement Fund. C7 is a resolution authorizing the city manager to enter into an agreement with the Wilmington and Beaches Convention and Visitors Bureau to provide tourism enhancement utilizing $650,000 of American Rescue Plan Act funding.
Mayor?
Yes, sir.
I know we had a presentation from CVB a couple meetings ago. It's probably my recollection, but I don't remember seeing a line item budget of how these funds were going to be utilized. It seemed more conceptual to me, but I couldn't find the presentation. So I'll just ask if we could receive the budget for how these funds are anticipated to be used.
Yes, we have. Jennifer Moretti has seen the budget for that.
Okay, thank you. And then also, what percentage of this, what percentage is $650,000 of the CVB's annual budget? And I don't need that information right now, but it would be nice to know. Thank you.
Okay. Public hearings. PH1 is an ordinance amending the official zoning maps of the city to rezone property containing 7.87 acres of land located at 516 and 520 Mosley Street from R5 medium density mixed residential district to MD10 CD medium density multiple dwelling residential district conditional district for a 60-unit senior housing development. Ordinances. 01 is an ordinance amending the Land Development Code Chapter 18 to exempt currently existing bona fide farm uses over 10 acres from certain zoning and permitting requirements, and this is being heard on a second reading. And then 02 is the ordinance making supplemental appropriation for the purchase of a mobile radio repeater and upfit for a pickup truck, creating a rapid response vehicle for the bomb squad, utilizing $40,000 of North Carolina drug tax revenue. And then finally, resolutions. The resolution authorizing the City of Wilmington's 2024 state and federal legislative agenda. And that concludes this agenda.
Mr. Mayor, if you'll entertain the thought of allowing me to run through the legislative agenda for you this morning so
Please.
that you can provide any feedback on it that you'd like, and then we can modify it for tomorrow night.
Thank you.
First off, we'll start by saying that Carol would normally be standing before you doing this in a much more professional fashion, but she is out on extended leave and will not be back in time for us to adopt the agenda ahead of you going to the NLC meeting next week. So we thought it was important to go ahead and get this in front of you. I do appreciate the opportunity to go through it, but I also want to remind council that with these goals, the city's traditionally focused on building relationships and finding points of common interest to which to pursue the legislative goals. We've made really great strides with regard to our relationship with our legislative delegations, simply by trying to find common points of interest as opposed to being in an antagonistic mode. This morning we'll cover, next slide please. I got it, never mind. Sorry, Dylan. This morning we'll cover the state and legislative recap and outlook and the federal legislative recap and outlook. We'll also generally keep the agenda broad with regard to the legislative goals, simply so that we can remain flexible in our in the pursuit of any specific legislation that may come up during the sessions. In addition, the state legislative session for this year will be considered to be the short session. It will be one that they will be trying to go in late and get out early, and so there will be limitations on those bills, and we'll talk about those in just a moment. Okay, Dylan, help me. Thank you. This is our state representation, Senator Michael Lee, who is the chair of the Appropriations and Base Budget Committee, also the chair of the Education and Higher Education Committee in the State Senate. Senator Bill Rabon, who is the chair of the Finance, Rules, and Operations Committee and the Select Committee on Nominations. Deb Butler serves on the Banking and Commerce Committee as well as the Regulatory Committee in the House. And Ted Davis serves as the vice chair of the Appropriations Committee, as well as he serves on the UNC Board of Governors Selection Committee. And finally, Representative Charlie Miller, who is the vice chair of Appropriations and Energy and Public Utilities Committee. It's also noteworthy to note that he serves as vice chair on the Joint Legislative Oversight Committee on Justice and Public Safety. That is a key role for our public safety folks and looking out for some of our interests there. As you can see, they've all got a diverse group of experiences and backgrounds as well as assignments, and they can provide a great deal of assistance to the city. In an attempt to go through the legislative recap from the last session, I think probably the two things that the legislature would point to as being the most important for them would be the Medicaid legislation as well as the sports betting legislation that went through and has recently taken effect. But from our perspective, there are a couple of things that were of great interest. First of all, we partnered with folks from across the state on the civilian traffic investigators. You'll remember that we already have this authority, but the rest of the state wanted the authority. It was actually passed. We were seeking to be able to have citation writing authority, but we're not granted that. So for the rest of the state, it was successful. For our interest, it was not necessarily as successful as we would have liked, but we were able to push that across the line. It is contingent on folks going through, at least in the new programs, going through training that will be set up by the Training and Standards Division. Workforce housing, there were a number of bills that were issued or were introduced in terms of workforce housing and trying to deal with that crisis. There were a number of them, as I mentioned. This was particularly one that was of interest to us in that it set up a statewide zoning regulations for certain single-family developments. It did not pass, and we fought against it only because we thought that the local option of zoning was much better and much more suited to municipalities than the statewide was. And then Senate Law 2023-59, this is a compromise bill as well, which imposes a penalty on local governments for late filing of audits. It withholds state sales tax payments as a penalty. The one thing that we were successful in doing statewide was being able to get an appeals procedure that was going to be put in place. It actually has to go through the local government commission and the state treasurer, and that we would then be able to do that. Hopefully we will not have to deal with this, but it is a penalty. They are evidently having some difficulty in getting audits into the state treasurer's office. The one thing I will say about that is it's becoming more and more difficult to find an auditor anywhere in the state because of the regulations that have to be maintained, or the knowledge that has to be maintained to do those audits. And then finally, the opioid quick response team. This is one that's been on our legislative agenda for a long time. You will recall that we set up an opioid response team here in New Hanover County. We were successful in getting individual bills that were funding that particular project over the course of time. The last couple of years, we had gotten $750,000 annually. This year, we were actually successful in getting it placed into the state budget, and it allocates a recurring $300,000 to the project. So while the amount is not as great, it is a recurring and does not have to be done on an annual basis. I will also note for you that there is local opioid settlement money that comes to New Hanover County and the city of Wilmington, and we are programming that into this response program as well. So this is a really big win for the opioid quick response team. Next, please. I think it's important to note the composition of the General Assembly. The Republicans have a supermajority in both the House and the Senate. That means essentially that if they vote along party lines, they can override a gubernatorial veto. It creates a dynamic where the Republican leadership really doesn't have to work with the Democrats since they have the veto-proof majority. And serving as the majority leader in the Senate is Paul Newton, and Representative Tim Moore will also continue as the Speaker of the House. There are, as I mentioned earlier, a number of things that will be coming up during the session, but they are going to be very ephemeral or short-term, short-lived. This is, again, the short session. Generally speaking, it is set aside for budget adjustments to be made from one year to the next, the second year of the biennium. Also eligible for consideration are bills that have passed one house or the other and not the second. Also, non-controversial local bills. Those are generally local bills that are supported by all of the delegation. The legislature will be looking to adjourn quickly as will be trying to get out for both federal and statewide elections in the coming year. So I would not expect a lot in terms of forewarning with regard to what might come out of this session, but as always, we will be on the outlook for pop-up projects that may come along. Next, please. With regard to our legislative efforts, these are our general state legislative initiatives. First of all, we will oppose legislation that undermines local government authority and revenue generation. That is, these are all pretty much standing legislative agenda items for us. We will continue to work to fund a strong film incentive program. We'll support a strong response to the discharge of chemicals contaminating our waterways, our air, and our drinking water. We'll support transportation funding that's reflective of Wilmington's growth, with the emphasis being on accessibility and resilience, and also equity with the rest of the state. We'll work to revise laws to provide additional tools for our law enforcement and our prosecutors. We'll invest in mental health treatment and services at the local level to respond to the North Carolina's opioid epidemic, and you will be seeing some of that coming through along with the budget. As I mentioned earlier, we'd have the opioid settlement money, and there's continuing growth in that area. You will once again be asked to bless the joint city-county opioid agenda. We'll support funding for coastal infrastructure, support state affordable housing program and ability for cities to address local housing challenges. We'll oppose modifications to the room occupancy tax distribution formula, and we'll fund regional research and rescue teams, especially as they relate to the fire folks. Are there any additions that council would like to add to that list? Yes, sir.
Can you walk us through how this is formulated and how it's historically been formulated?
Generally speaking, our legislative liaison will not only talk to the League of Municipalities, which we'll talk about in a minute, but the League of Municipalities and our contract legislator about the items that we think will be coming forward. And then we take the items also out of your strategic plan to be able to work on those initiatives towards these goals.
And then we have a meeting like this to solicit feedback from council?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Again, we try to keep these very general and broad so that we're able to respond to different items, and we also try to keep them that way so that we won't get necessarily in a confrontational situation unless we choose to.
And then my only specific question about the efforts that are on this slide are in the first one, opposing legislation that undermines local government authority. Specifically, my questions are about opposing legislation that changes municipal elections and sales tax revenue. I mean, wouldn't we support changes in tax formulas that improve our position?
We certainly can do, and I think that's always been an unspoken word, especially not only at the state level, but also with the city council. We will support on an as needed and as assessed situation those revenue sources that will expand that. Again, with it being a short session, I wouldn't imagine that the legislature would entertain anything of that magnitude. But we will support that as it goes forward. But we also are more interested in trying to defend what we've got simply because we are so limited. For example, in the last session, there was some effort to redistribute sales tax, and we had to fight against that as well. So generally speaking, it's a defensive strategy as opposed to an offensive strategy, but we certainly can put some language in there if council would like to.
Thank you.
Yes, Ms. Andrews.
Isn't that first one basically just the prime directive of the league?
It is very much in line with the league, yes, ma'am. Okay. With regard to our federal representation, Representative David Rouser now serves on the Agriculture Committee as well as the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, where he actually serves as the chair of the Subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment. That's a very important position, especially with regard to protecting of our drinking water and our air. Senator Tillis serves on the Finance Committee, the Judiciary Committee, where he is actually the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Intellectual Property. And then he also serves on the Banking and Housing and Urban Affairs Committee, where he serves as the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Financial Institutions and Consumer Protection. Senator Budd serves on the Armed Services Committee, the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, and the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. Given the divide among the parties, I don't think we'll see a whole lot of legislation going through at the federal level at this point in time, especially given that they too will be wanting to get out for an election process. But we wanted to make sure that there were certain items that are on that federal legislative agenda so that you'll be prepared, especially when you go to the NLC meeting next week. So meaningful legislation will be hard to come by, but what we will do is we'll seek support for local infrastructure transportation that will emphasize both resiliency and equity. I think the equity is one of those things that we've added recently as a result of the council's position with regard to the Cape Fear Memorial Bridge. We will seek increased resources for disaster recovery and mitigation. That is something that we always are interested in, as well as we'll continue to seek regulations of our discharges into the water supply sources. Continuation of federal support for beach inlets and waterways, obviously very important to our local economy. Support resource allocation to provide for federal opioid epidemic response, which we've already talked about at the state level. And then support affordable housing and historic preservation funding. There are a number of key partners we have in our legislative efforts. First of all, I'd like to recognize the League of Municipalities. They do work very closely with us. We are one of the few cities that actually has a legislative liaison, and I think they have some great appreciation for us having that position and working with them. The National League of Cities, which some of you will be attending the meeting next week, is another important partner, especially at the federal level. And then the North Carolina Metropolitan Mayors Coalition, of which Mayor Saffo is the chair this year, is also a very important group. That group, for those of you without any context, started out as a group that split off from the League of Municipalities and stood on its own and has now come back under the umbrella of the League of Municipalities. We'll continue to stay informed of Wilmington's needs and challenges raised through this council and the city's executive team and fortify the city's relationships with its policymakers at all levels. We will do a legislative breakfast with and invite all of our federal and state legislators. That is something that we have chosen to put off a little bit. We can simply because it is a short session and will not start until May. But also the coordination of that really takes more time than anybody on staff has without Kara being in place. We expect her to be back in the very near future, and we'll be setting up that legislative breakfast. Do you have any questions?
Any questions from me?
Would you like to modify, Mr. Joyner, the statement on the?
No, sir, I'm not asking for a modification. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. We have one presentation for you this morning following the briefing. It will come from, I assume, still, yes. Linda has had, is in her post-COVID state, so she's being very careful, but she will be doing an overview of the forthcoming Land Development Code amendments that you'll see, I believe, at your next meeting.
Good morning, Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, members of council. As Manager Caudle mentioned, this is a presentation on some upcoming Land Development Code amendments that are scheduled for public hearing on March 19th. It's a rather large package of amendments. I will say most of these really are considered to be cleanup. We're not seeing any large substantial changes, and the proposed changes are in the areas of permitted uses, site and building design, signs, and landscaping. The First Amendment deals with urban farms. Currently, urban farms require a special use permit in our residential districts. However, the code does specify numerous conditions that have to be met related to traffic, parking, truck traffic, as well as site design. And in looking at this, we had a recent request recently that brought this to our attention for an urban farm that has existed for many years with no issues in residential neighborhood. And staff is recommending that instead of requiring a special permit for these uses, that we permit urban farms subject to the conditions and the standards that are currently outlined in the Land Development Code, with one addition, and that would be to limit sales of products in residential districts to those grown on site, so that they can sell what they're producing. They cannot bring in products from outside to supplement those sales. The Second Amendment deals with townhouse units. If you'll look at the chart on the screen, you will see that quadruplexes, which is a four-dwelling unit building, is permitted with conditions in the R7 district. However, attached townhouses are not permitted in that district. So staff is recommending that we amend the regulations to permit townhouse buildings of up to 4 units in the R7 district to be consistent, since we're already allowing quadruplexes in that district. The amendments would also clarify that townhouses can be located on individual lots. This is something that is consistent with the way the code has been interpreted and applied by staff. However, we did have a specific request from an applicant from financing purposes that they would like to see that called out in the code to make sure that there were no questions from their lender. The Third Amendment deals with major vehicle repair, and again, this came up when staff was meeting with an applicant. Currently, you can see in our light industrial district, we allow minor vehicle repair and service. However, we do not allow major vehicle repair and service. And when you think about what the purpose of the light industrial district is, as well as the types of uses that are allowed there, that difference did not make sense. And so staff is proposing that we add that major vehicle repair and service as a permitted use. And you will notice, I mean, the two definitions are on the slide for you, and this is something where this work does take place indoors, so we're not talking about exterior work that's occurring. The next amendment is a clarification. We have two conflicting provisions currently in the Land Development Code relating to bicycle parking in the Central Business District. In one section that deals with the UMX and the Central Business District, it basically says there are no minimum parking requirements other than bicycle parking. However, another section specifically says that properties within the CBD are exempt from bicycle parking requirements. So we're simply clarifying the language in that section that deals with the UMX as well to be consistent that bicycle parking requirements do not apply within the CBD.
I'm sorry. I just couldn't hear you
That's okay.
clearly. Can you repeat the second piece that you said is a conflict?
It's, so we have two provisions. One says that no minimum parking requirements apply within the UMX or CBD other than bicycle parking. However, there's a second provision which specifically exempts properties in the CBD from bicycle parking requirements. So the proposed clarification is just to remove that inconsistency and retain that exemption for properties in the CBD for bicycle parking.
So it's to resolve it in favor of the second one that you
Yes.
mentioned? All right, thank you.
You go back to Amendment 3, just a quick question. You mentioned that all of this is done indoors. Do we need to say indoors only, or?
I believe that's handled in the standards, but that's something that we'll look at before the public hearing and have that answer for you.
Okay, and then the other one was where you talked about the farming piece, and you said that they're not to bring in anything to sell?
Correct.
Are they doing that now?
Not that I'm aware of. Right now, the reason this actually came up was because one of our existing urban farms asked for sales. And so as we looked at this, they were going to need a special permit to do that. We thought this was a better approach. And it's, again, just to sell what they're growing on site. But we thought that given that this is a residential district, it's not a commercial district, we wanted to be very clear that if we're going to allow sales, it's only for what they are producing on site and that they can't bring in other items to supplement that sales income.
Okay, thank you.
The next amendment is to address some very confusing language that we have in our code related to electric vehicle parking. And I will say this language is confusing for both applicants and staff. So anytime staff is confused by what is being required, we feel that we need to clean that up. One of the things that is a little bit confusing is that we use two different measurement standards in our regulations currently. In one standard, we reference a percentage of vehicle spaces that must have charging infrastructure. In another, we do it as a number of spaces, so one space for every 50 spaces. So the amendment removes that difference in how we measure and simply goes to a very simple 2% of spaces that are provided shall be electric vehicle ready with a full charging station, and that's consistent with what's required today. And then 2% shall be constructed with infrastructure to permit conversion to full charging stations in the future. Again, consistent with what we require today. So it's based on the total size of your parking lot, not the number of spaces you're required. That was one question the Planning Commission had. It's based on the number of spaces that you're providing, and 2% need to have a vehicle charging station. While the graphic shows you the different levels that exist for vehicle charging, we don't actually have a requirement. As long as you have an outlet and you can charge a vehicle, you are considered to be compliant with that standard. The additional 2% is basically providing that conduit and that infrastructure so that if additional spaces are needed in the future, they're easy to install.
Yes, sir.
Is this requirement for all new parking lots, multifamily, residential?
Correct.
Retail, it's just blanket,
Blanket based on number of spaces. It does not distinguish between use.
Okay, and then but the reasoning for this was because we had the 2% and then we had the number of parking spaces, but it's a requirement that we have had
Yes.
since we enacted the land development code, the new land development code.
Correct. And what we are proposing to do is to clarify the language to match the way in which it has been interpreted and applied across the board. It just is the language is very confusing as it's currently written.
I do have some issue. I take some issue with the government creating requirements for electric vehicle parking. I think, I have nothing against electric vehicles and fully support them, but I find that anytime the government mandates something, it typically has undue financial consequences on other items. One of our highest priorities is affordable housing. And so if we think for a second that this mandate from the city won't drive prices up for housing, I'd welcome to hear why that won't happen. These things are expensive to create. I've talked to some companies who have been mandated in recent months who are trying to expand their existing parking lots, and they're large businesses that are huge economic drivers for the city, and they had to put these projects on hold because you're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars in mandated required electric vehicle infrastructure that we're mandating they put in. The fact is, private business owners and property owners, I believe, know what's best to do with their property. Again, I have no issues with whatsoever with electric vehicles and could even support some sort of incentivization for EVs, but a blanket mandate is government overreach and is nothing less than that. And I would recommend changing this language from shall to may, just to kind of remove this requirement and this mandate. And I'll continue to advocate for that when it comes up. I believe these are all coming up next
March
month?
19th.
March
So
8th?
19th in 2 weeks.
Okay, thank you.
The next amendment would exempt local government signs on city or county-owned properties from signage regulations. We are proposing this because, quite frankly, many of our properties, be it the cities or the counties, don't necessarily lend themselves to signage regulations that are typically based on allocating sign area based on the linear foot of a facade. As you can see, the Riverwalk, you can think of our parks, we don't necessarily have properties that have buildings. In some cases, and in others, quite frankly, the services that we are offering, we feel it's really important for people to be able to find them. So this is something that we can do under statute, and staff is recommending that we take this step. The next amendment also deals with signage, and again, this one deals with clarification. One of the things that has happened over time is that we used to have standards for signs by district. So, for example, standards for the CBD, the UMX, the MX, and over time, as we amended the code, that things were merged together, and things that were clear when they were separate became less clear when we merged them. And so, for example, some of the regulations talk about an additional sign, but don't talk about in addition to what, in terms of what provision we're adding it to. So this basically rewrites the section on wall signs to be very specific and talk about exactly what you get based on the size of your building. It also does add some sign area because we are now considering ground floor signage separate from other wall signs on the building to recognize that you may have uses that need ground floor signage, but also while still wanting to allow for some upper story signage. So there is some additional sign area that is being proposed through this amendment. The next amendment deals with semi-urban frontage requirements. The map on your screen shows you the sections of streets in the city that are subject to the semi-urban frontage standards. There are two types of semi-urban frontages, semi-urban and semi-urban parkway. And there is a table 18-407.2 identifies the standards for each frontage type. And we realized that the standards for pedestrian access and signage that are on your screen were intended to be applied to both of those frontage types, but were inadvertently only applied to the semi-urban frontage. So the proposed amendment would amend that table to also apply those two standards to the semi-urban parkway frontage. The next one is, this is is a typographical error that actually has some significance. As you see the word no underlined, we inadvertently left out the word no from the phrase no more than when dealing with the amount of street frontage that can be occupied by driveways and parking for courtyard development. The intent was that we wanted to limit that to no more than 1/3 of the total lot width. The way it currently reads without the word no is that you have to occupy at least 1/3 of the total lot width. So we'd like to correct that.
Real quick on this courtyard development. So back to amendment number 5, but you can leave it at amendment number 9. Somebody brings this forward, this project right here forward. They would have to allocate 2%. This is some missing middle housing project that we need in our community. They would have to allocate 2% of EV parking infrastructure to this project in order to be approved.
That's my, yes.
As the code stands right now.
if you're dealing with, unless Brian has any corrections. Yes.
Thank you.
The last two amendments both deal with inconsistencies between our definitions section and our regulatory standards. We try very hard not to include regulatory standards and definitions. It's not a great practice, but quite frankly, there are some terms that are impossible to define without including some dimensions or some other piece of a regulation. So in this case, critical root zone, and then the next one deals with significant trees. When we were going through the adoption process of various amendments to the regulatory standards, changes were made to dimensional requirements that were not reflected in the definitions. We just simply failed to go to the definition and make the corresponding amendment. So in this particular case, we are proposing to revise the definition of critical root zone to be consistent with the standards for protection of critical root zones, which is that distance extends 1.25 feet for every inch in trunk diameter, and that is what is shown on your screen in the graphic that comes from the regulatory portion of the ordinance. And then the last amendment, similarly, it's the definition of significant tree. So the table that you'll see is part of the regulations, and this is, in both cases, this is how we have been interpreting and applying this, is that significant trees based on the type are either trees that have a minimum diameter at breast height of 8 inches, 18 inches, or 24 inches. However, if you were to read the definition, it would be 8 inches, 24 inches, and 32 inches. And this was a change that was specifically made, it's my understanding, during the adoption process to define what a significant tree is. And again, we just want to make the definition consistent with the regulations as they've been adopted and applied. And that is the last amendment, if there are any other questions.
Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
So I wanted to revisit the electric vehicle parking. Can you tell me what you mean by full charging station?
So full charging station basically just means power. So for example, and I know this actually came up with, I believe, Starway Village when they were looking at their project. And it was, and I think the way they worked it out is if you had a light pole and you put an outlet in it, we consider that a charging station. So it wasn't something where we're specifying a level 1, level 2, level 3, simply that you are providing an outlet for power that you can plug a vehicle into. And if someone needs an adapter to be able to use that outlet, that's on them to provide.
Okay. And then if they choose to provide a level 2 or the DC fast charge, there's no requirement that we're saying they have to provide that for free. Is that correct? It can
Yeah.
still be a pay station? Okay, thank you. I fully support this.
Let the market take care of itself. You know, we've been up here telling people where they could build car washes because there was already one. Let the market take care of itself. The developer sees fit to do this to enhance his project, let it be. To you to say just put a pole up and put a plug in, that's the oversimplification of what is involved in that. So let the market take care of itself, and it always will.
I just want to say that it took me a year and a half to get a plug-in hybrid vehicle. That's what the demand is out there. So the market is taking care of itself as far as people are buying these vehicles, and they need a place to plug them in if we're going to address the climate crisis, which is costing us all money. And I have my plug-in hybrid, I can plug into a 110-volt outlet. And if that's all you're requiring, I think that's a really, really low bar. And if it's 2%, and we're looking at that earlier project that might have 50 parking spots, that's one parking spot that they have to put a regular outlet in, and one that they have to make sure that the wiring's there for. I just think that's a super, super low requirement for what the demand is out there.
Just out of curiosity, if it's a residential development, all residential developments, whether they have a garage or if they have, you can have a plug-in somewhere. And if you're saying it's a 110, 120 volt in a residential area and you can plug it into your house, why would you require it in the development? I could see it maybe on commercial development. You know, you have people coming there, they come in to shop, they're coming from another area. they need to get the power. They'll have to make that determination, but on a single-family or townhouses or anything like that that has a garage, just curious, did y'all think
This-
through that process?
This is park for parking lots. So this is
Excuse me?
number of spaces provided in parking lots. So
Park-
we're not, parking lots. So we're not, so surface parking areas, parking facilities. We're not dealing with garages or driveways for single-family homes with this. This is the number of spaces.
So, wait a minute, because Luke had brought up an example that you had shown on that,
And there was some surface so there was some surface parking on that example. So, let me,
Get back to it real quick. Yeah,
so, I don't have a cursor to show you. So that was looking mostly at the spaces that are kind of at the bottom there, so where you have typical surface parking.
okay. All right. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a question with that then. So with this demonstration, if this housing project had 50 parking spaces, they would have to have
One.
2%?
So one space that would have access to an outlet.
Okay.
Luke, did you have a question?
Whether it's 1 or 100 is irrelevant, in my opinion. We are mandating what somebody has to do with their property and inadvertently causing additional costs to the developer, which will certainly be passed on to the tenant or the property owner, adversely affecting affordability. And we can say all day long, we can jump up and throw platitudes at affordable housing all day long, and we do it. Everybody does it up here. But when we continue to back policies like this, we are spitting in the face of everybody who's having trouble with affordable housing. And I'll continue to advocate against it, and I'll do it in a more thorough manner, I assure everyone, in a couple of weeks. This kind of stuff is it's dangerous to mandate things like this, and I can get into a whole lot of other mandates that we may do from a policy standpoint locally that adversely affect affordability. But this one is what's in front of us at the moment. So I'll just hold a lot of my other comments until our next meeting.
Anybody else? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. That's all we have for you this morning.
Okay, very good. All right, with that, we stand adjourned. Thank you.